"You don't belong in the records room," Barton Selway said, filling the doorway with his considerable frame. "Those files aren't for clerks to handle." Dora Stanhope set her traveling case down on the cold plank floor, met his gaze without looking away, and said, "I was hired to sort those files. Now I'd appreciate it if you stepped aside." She had nothing left to be afraid of losing. That was the thing people didn't understand about a woman who had already lost everything. There was a particular kind of freedom in it, the freedom of someone who has already paid the worst price and knows she will not pay it twice. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere that was rightfully yours, and walked in anyway, this story is for you. Subscribe to Faded Love, stay until the very last word, and leave a comment telling me where in Canada you're watching from tonight. I want to know how far this reaches. The wagon from Moose Jaw had dropped Dora at the edge of a track road with nothing more than a hand-lettered sign pointing 2 miles toward the Alcroft Land and Settlement Office, and the particular silence of the Saskatchewan prairie in late October, not peaceful silence, but the kind that pressed against the ears like a held breath. She had been traveling for 3 days. 3 days on roads that had shaken the fillings from her back teeth, eating food from a tin that tasted of rust and regret. 3 days with the letter folded inside her coat pocket, the letter that had offered her a position as records clerk for the Alcroft Land and Settlement Trust, which administered homestead grants for nearly 400 families across the Southern Territories. She had accepted without asking too many questions. After what had happened to her family's quarter section outside Portage la Prairie, after the solicitors and the fraudulent mortgage assignments, and the man who had shaken her father's hand while papers were being filed that would strip him of 30 years of breaking soil. Dora Stanhope had learned that comfortable situations were where the danger hid. You could at least see the edges of an uncomfortable one. That was worth something. She picked up her case and walked the 2 miles. The settlement office was a low timber building that looked as though it had been designed in a hurry and apologized for it ever since. Beside it, a larger storage structure and a 2-story residence for the staff. Out along the fence line that separated the property from the open grassland, a man was working alone, replacing a section of post and rail that had gone soft and listing. He worked without hurry, without flourish, setting each post by hand, checking it against his eye before tamping the earth. He wore a canvas work coat that had seen considerable weather, and a hat she could not have assigned to any particular decade. His hands, when she caught a glimpse, were the hands of someone who used them daily and had no interest in disguising the fact. He didn't look up when she passed. She kept walking, but she glanced back once before the office door, and he was already returned to his post, as though she had been a thing that passed through his field of vision and left no impression at all. The man who met her inside introduced himself as Barton Selway, Records and Operations Supervisor, and communicated his opinion of her arrival within the first 30 seconds. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with the expression of someone who had been inconvenienced by the existence of this particular Tuesday. "We've managed the records adequately until now," he told her. "I'd like to form my own opinion of that," she said. He led her to the records room, and she formed it immediately. The room was a testament to the creative possibilities of disorder. Land grant files from 3 different years shelved together without sequence. Survey maps folded against the grain and stuffed between boxes. Correspondence from the Dominion Land Office, stacked under a cast-iron doorstop that had left a perfect circle of rust on the top letter. Dora lifted it, read the letter beneath, a query from Ottawa regarding discrepancies in reported acreage for Block 7 of the Provisional District, and noted that it was dated 14 months ago and had never been answered. "How long have the records been in this state?" she asked. "Long enough," Selway said, which told her nothing except that he was a man well practiced in saying nothing. He left her with the chaos and the particular feeling that she had walked into something considerably larger than a filing position. She didn't mention that she had spent 7 years managing land records and agricultural accounts for the Stanhope family property. She didn't mention that she knew exactly what properly maintained records looked like, and exactly what their absence was designed to conceal. She lit the lamp and started at the beginning. That evening, the staff gathered for supper in the residence kitchen. Selway, 2 field surveyors named Cobb and Clark, and a young man of perhaps 20 called Kit Tolliver, who managed the supply stores and had the watchful eyes of someone keeping his own careful accounts of things he hadn't been asked to count. The conversation was ordinary on the surface. Selway talked about survey timelines and efficiency and the standards he expected. Cobb and Clark ate and nodded. Kit ate quietly and watched. Then the door opened, and the man from the fence line came in. He pulled off his hat, served himself from the pot without announcement, and sat down at the far end of the table. Selway didn't acknowledge him. The man didn't acknowledge Selway. But something in the room shifted at his arrival, a subtle realignment, as though a second weight had been placed on a scale that everyone was pretending wasn't being measured. Kit leaned slightly toward Dora and said, in a voice meant only for her, "That's Jude. He does repairs and maintenance around the property. Stays in the small building out back." "He lives here?" "Has done since autumn. Nobody tells him when to come and go." Kit paused. "Nobody does." "Why not?" Kit looked at his plate. "Don't know exactly, just nobody does." Dora looked down the table at the man called Jude. He was eating with the same quality of attention he had given the fence post. Complete, present, not performing anything for anyone. At one point he looked up and found her watching. He didn't look away. He held her gaze for one even moment, then returned to his supper. It was the least theatrical exchange she could have imagined. It was also the thing she was still thinking about when she lay awake that night, while the wind came off the prairie with a sound like the edge of something large and indifferent. She was back in the records room by midnight. What she found in those hours of sorting was enough to keep her at the lamp until nearly 3 in the morning. On the surface, the files looked like incompetence, poorly maintained, disorganized, the product of years of carelessness. But incompetence had a different texture than intention, and Dora Stanhope had learned to tell them apart. Incompetence left things where they fell. Intention moved them. The patterns emerged slowly, like figures in fog. Homestead grant allocations that didn't match the original survey parcels. Land assignments to a holding company called Ramsey Holdings, whose registration address was a solicitor's office in Regina. Transfer documents that moved parcels from legitimate homesteader claims to this holding company. Each transaction listed as a routine administrative reassignment. Each one authorized under the trust's standard filing protocols. Each one signed not by the trustee but by someone lower in the chain whose authority to execute such assignments was, at the very least, deeply questionable. She was still sitting with the open files when she heard footsteps in the hall. She looked up. Jude stood in the open doorway, not leaning against the frame, not performing ease, simply standing with the stillness of a man who had stopped because he intended to stop. "Late to be working," he said. "The problem is larger than I expected." He looked at the files spread across the table. His eyes moved over the open land grant register with a particular kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who already knew what was there and was checking whether she had found it yet. "When were these last properly maintained?" she asked. "Before Selway took over the administrative side," he said. "About 2 years ago." "What happened 2 years ago?" He was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw long shadows between them. She had the clear impression of a man calculating not deception, but the weight a particular moment could carry. "Things changed," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He looked at the register once more. "Don't work alone too late," he said. "Lock up when you leave." Then he was gone. She sat with his words until the lamp began to gutter. Don't work alone too late. It wasn't a threat. She had heard enough of those in her life to know the difference. It was a warning, the kind offered by someone who already knew something and could not yet say what. She locked the room, went to bed, and did not sleep. In the morning she found Jude behind the storage building, splitting wood for the week's supply. She stopped beside him and waited until he set the axe down. "Do you know the name Ramsey Holdings?" she asked. Something in him went completely still. Not the stillness of someone searching their memory. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for a particular question and is now deciding how to answer it. "Where did you see that name?" he said. "On 14 separate land transfer documents, parcels moved from settled homesteader claims to a holding company in Regina. Each one listed as routine, none of them routine." She watched his face. "Those parcels aren't valued at what the documents say." They sit directly adjacent to the route the CPR is planning for its southern spur expansion. Railway-adjacent land in this territory is worth 5 to 10 times its current assessment. He picked up the axe, set it down again. Yes, he said quietly, it is. You already knew about this. I know about all of it. He looked at her steadily. The transfers, the reassigned, the way the records were allowed to deteriorate so that no one could easily trace the sequence. It's a systematic operation. Victor Ramsey isn't an administrator running a land office badly. He's using the trust's filing authority to assemble a corridor of railway-adjacent land, parcel by parcel, at fraudulent prices. When the corridor is complete, he sells it to the CPR at full market value and disappears behind his legal structure. She stared at him. And you've known this and said nothing to. To whom? He said quietly, but with an edge she had not heard from him before. The Dominion Land Office in Regina has 2 senior clerks who have accepted payments from Ramsey. The territorial magistrate is his brother-in-law. Reporting suspicion to a compromised system doesn't stop a fraud. It warns the people running it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not describing this like someone who heard about it secondhand. A silence stretched between them, taut and complicated. Then Selway's voice cut across the yard, directing Jude to the north fence before noon. Jude picked up the axe. We'll talk later, he said very quietly. The letter you found in the reassignment files, the one with the routing instructions, don't put it back. He walked away. Dora stood in the cold prairie morning with the certainty settling over her that she had not arrived at a disorganized land office. She had arrived at the center of something she recognized. Because she had lived inside its wreckage before, in a farmhouse outside Portage-la-Prairie, watching her father read a document and not understand what it had already taken from him. She was not going to stand at the edge of this and do nothing. Not this time. She went to find Jude that evening at the small building out back. The door was open against the cold. He was at a narrow table working with a length of rope. Methodical, efficient, nothing wasted. On the shelf above him, a handful of books that surprised her. Land tenure law, a history of the CPR, a surveyor's handbook that looked genuinely used rather than displayed. She sat down across from him and said, "Tell me who you actually are." He set the rope down. "My name is Jude Alcroft," he said. "This trust was established by my father. I am the sole trustee." The silence that followed had considerable weight in it. "You own this entire operation," she said. "Yes." She looked at the canvas coat, the weathered hands, the narrow bunk against the wall. "And you've been living here as a carpenter." "I've been working here," he said, "the way my father worked, because I don't know any other way to understand what something needs unless I've stood inside it. And you arranged for me to be hired." He met her eyes without looking away. "I arranged for someone with proper records experience and a particular understanding of fraudulent land transfers to be brought in." The air went out of the room. "You knew about my family," she said. "I knew that the Stanhope property outside Portage-la-Prairie was taken 3 years ago through forged mortgage assignment documents. I knew you had managed the family's land records for 7 years before that." He held her gaze. I needed someone who would recognize what was in those files, not as an abstraction, but as something she had already lived through the consequences of. Something moved through her that was not simple anger, though anger was part of it. He had made her part of this without telling her what she was walking into, without telling her anything at all. "You don't get to decide for me what I'll agree to do," she said. "You're right," he said. "That was wrong. I'm telling you now." She stood and crossed to the window. The prairie outside was immense and dark, the sky enormous with cold stars. Her father's farm, the same mechanism, the same slow patience of papers filed in the right order against someone who didn't know to look for them. She turned back. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something in him shifted. Not relief, exactly, but the careful posture of a man who has been holding something at considerable effort and has just been permitted to set it down. "Everything in those records," he said. "Documented, sequenced, irrefutable. Ramsey arrives in 3 weeks for the quarterly review. If we don't have a complete case filed before then, he will remove the most compromising files and the trail disappears." "I need full access," she said. "Every file, every correspondence, everything." "You'll have it. And I need you to understand something." She looked at him directly. "I am not doing this for the trust. I am doing this because the families who filed those homestead claims came to this province to build something and had it taken from them before they understood it was gone. The same way no one fought for my family." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I know," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I asked you." She pulled on her coat. "We start tomorrow," she said, and walked back across the dark yard with the prairie wind against her face, and the knowledge settling into her that she was no longer sorting someone else's paperwork. She was building something, and this time, she intended for it to hold. The weeks that followed were the most methodical work of Dora's life. She arrived in the records room before anyone was awake. She worked in layers, cataloging first, then cross-referencing, then building the sequence that showed not just that the numbers diverged, but how the money moved and where it ended up. She kept her findings in a locked case she had brought from home, the only container in that building she controlled completely. Kit Tolliver found her on the 6th morning with 2 mugs of tea and the careful expression of someone who has decided to say something and isn't sure of the reception. "The settlers have been talking," he said, setting a mug down. "A few of them came in last week while you were working. They know their grants have been reassigned. They just don't know how to fight it." "How many families?" 11 with reassigned parcels. 3 more with flagged claims that haven't cleared. She set down her pen. "Kit, has your land warrant ever reflected a different acreage than what your original claim specified?" He was quiet for a long moment. "By 12 acres, he said finally. "They told me the survey had been adjusted, that it was standard procedure." He looked at the register. "It wasn't standard, was it?" "No," she said, "it was not." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "What do you need from us?" Something shifted in her chest. Not sentiment, but something more structural. The understanding that what she was carrying was no longer hers alone. "Bring me your original grant documentation," she said. "Everything you were given when you filed. I'll speak with the other families. Anyone who kept their papers." Kit nodded once and left. Dora turned back to the register. By evening she had documented the mechanism of a fraud affecting 14 families, representing nearly 2,000 acres of prime railway-adjacent prairie land, assembled piece by piece through the patient exploitation of a record system that no one had been hired to properly maintain, until now. She was binding the documentation when Jude appeared in the doorway. "Selway sent a telegraph this afternoon," he said. "I found the carbon." "To Ramsey?" "To Ramsey. He knows someone's been in the deep files." He looked at the bound document set on the table. "We may not have 3 weeks." She looked at the set in front of her. Not complete, not everything she had planned to build, but perhaps enough. "When does the eastbound train run?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, 6:15 from the Moose Jaw Junction." She looked at the documents, then at him. "How fast can you be ready?" His expression was what she had come to recognize as his version of certainty. Not announced, not performed, simply present. "Before you are," he said. They were on the 6:15 in a carriage that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, with the document case across Dora's lap and the prairie moving past the windows in the flat gray light of a November dawn. No punishing overnight ride. No horses pushed past endurance. Just the steady rhythm of the rails and the particular tension of 2 people carrying something important toward the only place it could be made official. At a junction stop an hour east, 2 men boarded 2 cars back. Jude noticed them before Dora did. He said nothing, only moved his bag to the aisle-facing side and shifted slightly in his seat. "Ramsay's people," he said quietly, when the conductor had passed. "They can't act openly on a train," Dora said. "No, but they'll be in Regina when we arrive." She thought about the 4 loose pages she had separated out before leaving. The most critical entries, duplicated by hand, tucked inside her coat against her body in case the case itself was taken. "Then we go directly to the Dominion Land Office from the station," she said. "We don't wait." There was one other thing she needed to tell him. She had found it 2 nights before and had been carrying it carefully, deciding how. "Jude," she said, "the first reassignment 26 months ago, the originating transfer." "Yes." "The signature on the authorization document is yours." He was quiet for 1 beat too long. "Ramsay used your standing administrative authorization," she said carefully. "He presented the first transfer as a routine internal restructuring, and you signed it without understanding what it was." Every subsequent transfer cited that first document as evidence of owner cooperation, without ever coming back to you for a second signature. Because coming back would have required explanation, he said. And the explanation would have exposed the fraud before he'd assembled enough of the corridor to make it worth the risk. She held his gaze. He used your signature as a key. He only needed to borrow it once. He looked out the window at the prairie moving past. That's what he'll use in his defense, he said. Owner authorization. Willing participant. It is, she said, which is why the argument I've built doesn't try to minimize that document. It puts it first and explains it in sequence. Every subsequent transfer that proceeded without your signature isn't just evidence of fraud. It's the proof that the first signature was obtained through misrepresentation. A genuine restructuring would have required your ongoing involvement. The silence after the first document. That silence is the mechanism. He looked at her. I built that argument on the train from Moose Jaw to here, she said, while you were watching the two men in the back carriages and thinking I hadn't noticed. Something moved in his expression, the closest she had seen him, come to being genuinely caught off guard. The Dominion Land Office was a stone building on Victoria Avenue with the deliberate permanence of a structure built to communicate that the Dominion meant what it said. The registrar, a man named Fowler who wore his authority in the set of his jaw, looked at Dora's road-dusty coat and Jude's canvas workwear and the document case between them, and informed her that he was preparing to close for the day. I need 5 minutes, Dora said, and then you may decide for yourself whether to close. She placed the document on his desk first. Not the land transfers, not the financial records, but a letter. Victor Ramsey to Barton Selway, dated 4 months ago, on Ramsey holding instructions for how the reassignment files were to be handled in the event of any records review, which files to move, which survey maps to replace. A destruction protocol in Ramsey's own hand, written before Dora had ever been hired. He had anticipated a review. He had planned for it. He had written down his contingency and signed it. Fowler read it. His expression changed. Sit down, he said. She walked him through the full sequence the same way she had organized it, the fraud in its clearest form first, so that everything following made sense. The original homestead grants, the reassignment documents, the movement of funds through Ramsey Holdings, the railway corridor she had mapped from the survey parcels, parcel by parcel, each one a piece of something that together was worth a fortune to a railway company planning its spur line south. The 14 sworn statements from families who had kept their papers because they had the instinct of people who understood that in this country, paper was the only land you held before you had land. And then last, she placed the first transfer document on the desk, the one with Jude's signature. She had positioned it deliberately at the bottom of the set, so that by the time Fowler reached it, the full context of manipulation was already undeniable. Fowler looked at it. He looked at Jude. Jude said, I am Jude Alcroft. The trust is mine. That signature was obtained through misrepresentation of the document's purpose. Every subsequent transfer proceeded without my knowledge or authorization. The pattern of those transfers, 7 additional conveyances, none bearing my signature, is not coincidence. It is the proof that the first document was never what it was represented to be. Fowler sat back and looked at the full set spread across his desk. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing his understanding of something large. I'm going to need to contact the commissioner's office, he said. This reaches beyond my authority to adjudicate alone. He reached for his pen. In the meantime, I'm issuing an emergency stay on all pending transfers under the Alcroft Trust filing number, effective immediately. Dora let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. Victor Ramsey was intercepted by the NWMP at the Regina station 2 days later, arriving for what he had expected to be a routine quarterly review, and finding instead a formal suspension notice and 2 officers with a warrant. His solicitor was speaking before the carriage door fully opened. Dora, standing at the edge of the platform with Jude beside her and Fowler's receipt for the filed documentation in her coat pocket, watched Ramsey look from the warrant to the suspension notice to the officers, and then, finally, across the platform to where she stood. He had the expression of a man encountering a consequence he had not designed for. How much does she actually have? He said to his solicitor quietly. His solicitor, who had read the filed documents the previous afternoon, said, all of it. Barton Selway, it emerged, had kept his own copies of certain documents, insurance, he had called it, meaning protection for himself. He provided them to the commissioner's investigator in exchange for a reduced charge. The investigation ran 4 months. The findings were thorough. Ramsey Holdings was dissolved. The fraudulent transfers were voided. 14 homestead families received confirmation of their original grant parcels, with interest from the trust's remaining assets. On the afternoon the commissioner's final ruling was delivered. Kit Tolliver found Dora in the records room, where she was finishing the proper organization of the files, the actual job, the one that had always been there beneath the other one, and told her the news with the expression of a young man who has just witnessed something he needed to see and will not forget. "All 14 families," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Jude's out by the north fence," he said, with the particular careful casualness of someone who is not being casual at all, "in case you wanted to tell him." She found Jude where Kit had said, resetting a section of post-in rail that had shifted over the winter freeze, working with the same even patience she had first noticed. From a distance on a road she had walked because she had no other choice, toward a building she had not known would become the place she rebuilt herself. He set down the post setter when he saw her coming. She told him. He listened. 14 families, he said. 14, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The prairie around them held its enormous, indifferent stillness. "I want to say something," he said carefully. "I've been finding the right words for it since the night you sat down across from me and told me to tell you the truth." She waited. "I spent 2 years working quietly and alone because I didn't trust anyone enough to let them carry part of it," he said. "And then you arrived, and within 3 days you had found everything I had spent months documenting." He held her gaze with those steady, dark eyes. "The difference wasn't only that you were capable. It was that you cared. Not because you were paid to. Because you understood from the inside what it costs when the wrong people win. I have never met anyone who understood it the same way." The wind moved through the dry grass along the fence line. "That still doesn't make what you did right," she said. "I know it doesn't." "But," she said and paused, "I came here with nothing. I came because a letter offered me work, and work was what I had left. I didn't come here expecting." She stopped. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not finished," she said. He stayed quiet. "I came here expecting a filing job and found a fraud and a man who had been working alone long enough to forget how to ask for help directly." She looked at him. "That's a thing you're allowed to do. Ask directly, from now on." Something shifted in him, visible even in the economy of his expression. The posture of a man receiving something he hadn't permitted himself to expect. "Stay," he said, one word, no decoration around it, no performance, nothing except what it meant. She looked out at the prairie, at the flat, patient, enormous land that had taken her family's hope and given it back to her in a form she hadn't recognized until she was already standing inside it. "I think I already decided that," she said. "I just hadn't said it out loud." They stood there while the afternoon light went long and gold across the grass, while the prairie held its enormous silence around them in the particular way of open country that has witnessed more than it will ever be asked to describe. What came after was ordinary, which was exactly what she had wanted and never thought to ask for. The records room was properly organized by February. The 14 families had their land confirmed in the spring registry. The work of the trust continued under proper administration, with Jude finally visible as what he had always been, and Dora beside him in a role that had no clean title, which suited them both entirely. Her father would not have used the word justice. He had been too practical a man for abstractions. He would have said, "The papers are in order now. The right names are on the right documents. That's what it comes down to in the end." She thought, on a quiet April evening, with the light going long over the Saskatchewan grass and Jude beside her saying nothing, because he was the kind of man who understood that some things were better held than spoken. She thought her father would have been satisfied. She thought she was too.